While the exterior was set aside to cure after a final coat of clear, I moved on to the interior in the meantime. All of the parts were cut out of the sprues where necessary, cleaned up a little bit here and there, and some also got a little sanding for the paint to stick better to it. I then started off with priming them in a light coat of light gray primer from Streetblisters. After that had cured, I moved on to giving the base color of the interior. So like I said in the video where I painted the exterior of this car, I was inspired by a video of Mr. JWW. He was at a car show and stumbled upon an Aventador in a similar blue color with a super cool orange interior. And I wanted to replicate that on this one. And the color I decided for the interior to be was Gulf Orange, as that was closest to the interior color that I found online and in the video of Mr. JWW. It covers really nice and quick, so about 2 coats was required for it to be fully covered and set aside to cure, for me in the meantime to either start masking it off after and start painting the black. So while I was waiting for the orange parts to dry, I moved on to painting other parts black. After that has been completed, about an hour or 2 passed before I carefully started masking off some of the orange parts, specifically on the steering wheel and on the dashboard, for the black contrasting parts to be painted too. All the parts have been masked off that needed to be masked off, and I could start painting the black areas. In this case, I'm starting to paint the carpet or the base for the interior with a black, as I'm going to be adding some black flocking on top of it, not to overdo it with orange of course, and some other pieces of the dashboard were painted black too. A couple light coats of black later and the unmasking could start. In one of my previous videos I was struggling a bit between trying some new techniques for the flocking to stick to the parts that I wanted to, and some of you suggested to add some paint retarder to the paint itself, as normally the paints that are available these days dry really quickly or aren't simply that good of a quality paint. So what I decided to do, since I had some paint retarder laying around from Vallejo, is use some Vallejo black, add a bit of the paint retarder to it. That makes it dry a lot slower, and then carefully start doing it in small sections, applying the paint really wet and quick, then going over it with the flocking material, making sure that it is spread nicely, and then move on to the next section until the entire floor was covered. So overall, I'm really happy with this new technique. The paint retarder slowed down the drying process of the paint enough for it to stay sticky and glue on the flocking material, and it works really well. I might need to tweak it a little bit in the future and also try some with Tamiya paints or some other brands, but for now this one works really well and I'm glad you guys suggested it. And with the final bits of flocking now added, I could set that part aside to cure for a little bit and move on to some other details on the dashboard. Some of the smaller buttons were first painted with a flat black and the surrounds too, and later the surrounding areas as sort of trim pieces were covered with a gloss black to give it a nice contrasting and modern looking feel. The top section of the dashboard was painted in a flat black, and just to give it a bit more contrast I decided to paint the grills for the speakers with another paint, also a flat black, but it just gives a bit of a different sheen to it just to make it stand out a little bit more and not make it look like one big piece. So like I said, some of the other contrasting trim pieces on the interior were also painted with a gloss black, just to make it a bit more modern and also just give it a cool look, of course. So the main pieces have now been painted in the orange. Also the black and gloss black has been added, so I could finish it up with a couple final touches, as some of these pieces were highlighted with a bit of silver on a couple of the vent moving pieces. No idea what those are called, but let's just stick with vent moving pieces. And also some of the buttons for the controls were painted with a silver highlight too. With all of the painting now completed, I could move on to adding final details like the decals itself, and in this case I decided to do it correctly. On the last build for the Aventador that I did a couple of years ago, I had no clue on what was going on with that gauge cluster, but it just turns out it needs to be stuck on the inside, and that turns the whole image around and actually works really well and adds a lot of detail to the gauge cluster itself. So all of the decals have been added and put in place, and I could then carefully start gluing it all together. The door handle has been glued in place, and that is it for the interior for now. Of course, the door panels are not glued in, as they need to be glued onto the doors themselves, and the doors I plan to have open and close, so those will come at a later stage. The headliner and other pieces will of course come at a later stage in the build too, but for now this is it on the interior side of things, and next time I will probably be moving on to the engine and chassis.